35 years of celebration, winter. Gu Weiu stood at the gate of the city wearing a fox fur. On both sides were kneeling people. They were bowing their heads and crying, and many people stood beside her, her princess cousin, and her and Li Kainyuan's cousin. Family. Behind them, there are hundreds of officials bowing their heads and wiping tears. This is a big battle. This kind of battle was only experienced many years ago, when the last Wei Qiaogong and her father-in-law died on the battlefield. That time, Gu Weiu was still in Lanja and didn't see it with his own eyes. He only heard that His Majesty led the Begwan to stand in front of the long street and greeted the general back home amidst the cries of the people. It seemed that it was also such a winter day, the snow was heavy, and there was a lot of snow on the ground, and a big pit could be formed by stepping on it. Gu Weiu liked this snowy day very much in the past. She likes to hold standing in front of the window with Li Kainyuan's hand to enjoy the snow. She liked to stretch out to the window while he was not aware of it, and let the snowflakes fall on her palm and turn into water, and then let him wipe her hands under his pampering and helpless eyes. I like it. I like to behave like a baby and let him go to the plum garden to pick the most gorgeous plum with her back. But now, nothing left. There are obviously so many people beside her, but there is not the most familiar figure. Her husband, her general, can no longer carry her to pick plum blossoms. Bai Lu held the umbrella for her on the side. She looked at Gu Weiu's calm and watery face, as if she wanted to say something, but she opened her lips slightly, hesitated for a few seconds, and finally she didn't say anything. In fact, who of these people around Gu Weiu doesn't want to talk to her? They were all worried about her. Since the news of Li Kainyuan's death came, Gu Weiu seemed to have become dumb overnight, without saying a word, not crying. She still wakes up as usual, sleeps as usual, and handles the house's house affairs as usual, as if nothing has happened. Only her waning figure makes it clear that she is not so indifferent. They hoped that she would cry bitterly, better than holding on like this. Coming. I don't know who it is, so he said so. Everyone looked at the gate of the city. Gu Weiu's face that had been calm for many days finally changed at this moment. Her hands were tightly clenched into fists where no one saw them, and she had become thin. The face with the pointed chin was tight, and the lips that were frozen by the wind and snow were pressed into a straight line. It seems that this is the only way to vent her emotions. The first entry is the national flag of Dazhu, and then a few battle flags engraved with the word Li. At this time, these battle flags were in the icy world and were blown by the hunting wind, and behind it was a black coffin. The soldiers on both sides pushed the coffin forward in silence. No one spoke. Even those people who had been crying sorely stopped crying the moment they saw the appearance of the coffin. Gu Weiu could not see anything else anymore. Her clear and lingling eyes stared at the coffin unblinking at the moment. The coffin has been pushed to the city gate. The wheels stopped. Fu Xian, covered in snow, walked to Gu Weiu and knelt down on one knee. The man who was originally energetic, snow covered his head at the moment, as if he was 10 years old, kneeling in front of her with red eyes and a dumb voice. Tell her, He choked up, I couldn't bring him back safely. Gu Weiu did not speak. She didn't even seem to hear him talking, her eyes always fell on the coffin. Suddenly, she moved. Lady Li Ping. Those people didn't know what she was going to do, so they called her aloud, but Gu Weiu didn't listen, and walked straight to the coffin. She was dressed in plain clothes, and she seemed to be in harmony with the world, but there was still no snow on top of her head. After a while, her hair was covered with snow, and even the crow feather-like eyelashes were covered with snow, which blurred her vision. She didn't say anything, just stretched out her hand and stroked the coffin inch by inch to wipe the snow off the coffin. How can you wipe it clean? She wipes an inch away, and the empty place will be covered again. Her hands and her face have long been numb from the cold, but she just wiped it like this as if she didn't feel it. The gentle movements seemed to be wiping the face of the beloved. leaping. Seeing her like this, Xiao Jingxing couldn't bear it, so he stepped forward with an umbrella to cover the snow on her head, and sighed softly, "Stop it. Cousin." Gu Weida finally spoke. She hadn't spoken for more than 10 days. When she first spoke out, her voice was very soft and dumb. "He loves being clean, and I can't let him go home like this. He will be unhappy." Leaping. Xiao Jingxing looked at her and opened his mouth, but couldn't say a word. He could only look at her like this. Everyone was watching her, watching this slender woman, standing next to the coffin, as if wiping the beloved thing, wiping the dark coffin inch by inch. No one speaks. The wind grew stronger, as if someone was crying. Gu Wei's long hair was also disturbed by the wind, but she didn't care about it. Someone put an umbrella on the coffin, and then more and more people, more and more umbrellas. Their eyes were red, no speaking, quietly watching Gu Wei wipe the coffin. At last, wipe the coffin clean. Gu Wei's delicate face showed a small smile. She put her face on the coffin. "General, I'm here to take you home." "We," she said in a gentle voice, "going home." Hunting in the cold wind. Gu Wei stood next to the coffin holding an umbrella, and everyone was always by his side. The people all over the capital knelt down on the long street and took their generals home in this way. Li Kainyuan's funeral was very simple. When doing the funeral, everyone was worried that Gu Wei would fall, but she always remained sensible and sober, not crying or making trouble, calm and composed. She received guests and chose a blessed place, never showing a trace of weakness or unbearableness. After the funeral, Fu Xian knelt in front of Gu Wei. "How did he die?" Gu Wei asked him with his eyes down, his expression calm. "He was seriously injured in the battle at Yanmen Pass. Later, we were attacked. He, in order to protect me, used arrows to pierce the heart." Fu Xian lowered his head, but still couldn't cover the vicissitudes of life. His eyes were red and his voice was dumb. Then, the back that had been straight before seemed to be unable to hold up and squatted. "If it weren't for me, he wouldn't die. He told me." Gu Wei looked at him and said something irrelevant. "You grew up together, and when you were young, you protected him a lot. Therefore, he protected you to death. I don't blame him." "Sister-in-law." Gu Wei raised his hand to stop his confession, and only asked, "What did he leave me?" "When I got to him, he was out of breath, but he firmly held a sachet in his hand." Fu Xian trembled, took out a blood-stained sachet from his arms and handed it to her. Gu Wei looked at the sachet, his eyes moved slightly, and his hand on the table shook slightly. Quite a while. She just reached out and took it. This was the sachet she gave to Li Kainyuan the year she married Li Kainyuan. At that time, her female celebrity was not good and her stitches were bad. Later, she always wanted to give him another one, but he still refused, totally not. Ashamed, he kept hanging around his waist. The blood on the sachet had already dried up. She held it tightly, as if she could think of the man holding the sachet before dying. In fact, even if he didn't leave a message for her, she could guess what he would say. Even if he died, he would arrange everything for her so that she would not be aggrieved at all. He is such a person, no matter where he is. No longer will leave her a way out. The wind and snow outside seemed to have not stopped, and it was rustling, making the room quieter. "I don't know how long it took." Gu Wei said, "Go down." Fu Xian was still a little worried about her. The woman in front of him hadn't cried for so long after the incident, but he was really unsuitable for being too much, so he had to say, "I will let Bailu in." After he finished speaking, he went out to look for Bailu. Before he could find Bailu, he saw Zhao Chenju and his wife. The couple approached him holding umbrellas. Fu Xian and Zhao Chenju looked at each other, and no one spoke. He was tired of Zhao Chenju, but his wife was Gu Wei's cousin, so he naturally didn't have the right to stop them. Seeing their husband and wife walk forward without squinting, he pursed his lips and continued to search for Bailu. When he walked to the door of the closed house, Zhao Chenjue said, "You are just outside." The voice was cold, and it didn't seem to be to his wife at all. Seeing him like this, Wang Zhao's sharp nails pinched the flesh of his hands, a look of jealousy and anger flashed in her eyes. She suppressed her voice, but couldn't suppress the resentment in her heart, and said harshly, "You are just like that. Confident, if Li Qingyuan is dead, she will come back to you. She hates you so badly that she doesn't have you anymore. Even if Li Qingyuan is dead, she won't go with you." Hearing these words, Zhao Chenjue turned his head abruptly. His usual jade-like face was now black and violent, and he couldn't hide his violent expression. "If you want to be this Mrs. Zhao, just shut up." Finished. Regardless of her look, he pushed the door and walked in. Wang Zhao watched the moment he turned around, and completely removed the brutality on his face. His movements were gentle, his eyebrows were gentle, and that gentleness was completely different from the usual disguised appearance. The real, even those deep phoenix eyes had light that couldn't be hidden. She just clutched her heart and watched her husband enter another woman's room with joy and expectation with red eyes. The woman she called her cousin. She could imagine what Gu Weihou would think of her after Zhao Chenjue said that later. She must be very proud. She tried her best to Zhao Chenjue from her. After so many years, she finally became Mrs. Zhao, but in the end she still wanted to watch her husband look for her. It's ridiculous. No matter how light the movement was, the old door still made a squeak. Zhao Chenjue closed the door carefully, as if he was afraid of disturbing the cleanliness of the people in the house, or perhaps he was afraid that the cold wind outside would freeze her until he closed the door until there was no air in the room. Then he called her, very brutal. He shouted very softly and softly. He was very excited, and there was a smile that couldn't be hidden on his face. He leaped for being able to approach her at such a close distance once again. Accompanied by the bang 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 heartbeat, he approached her step by step and frowned when he watched her stand in front of the window holding Li Qingyuan's tablet, but still warmly said, "It's windy and snowy outside, why are you standing there? You came." Gu Weihou seemed to have guessed that he would show up a long time ago, and didn't look back. He just said lightly when he was about to close the window, "Keep it open, I want to see the snow." Zhao Chenjue's hand was still as she wished. He retracted his hand and stood beside her, his eyes still swayed a little when he saw her face. After so many years, they are all because the years have changed. Only she is the same as before. Years seemed to treat her very kindly, and could not find a trace on her face, even more vivid than when she left him. "I remember when it snowed before, you liked to lie in my arms the most. Let me move the chaise couch to the window and hold you to see the snowy scenery outside." Maybe I remembered that Zhao Chenjue was stuck in the past. In the memories of the love between the two, he bent his eyebrows and couldn't help but lifted his lips. "It's pretty brutal, can I take you home?" "Home?" Gu Weihou lowered his head, looked at the tablet in his hand, stroked his name with lingering fingers, smiled lightly, "I don't have a home anymore." Zhao Chenjue didn't see her the most. When he was at the gate of the city that day, he wanted to pull her away from the coffin at all costs, but he still had concerns that day when everyone was in full view, but now, he doesn't have any concerns anymore. He had a calm face and an angry voice, "Why don't you have a home? I'm still alive." Perceiving his attitude, Zhao Chenjue took a deep breath, barely suppressed the jealousy and resentment in his heart, and changed a gentle tone to her and said, "It's pretty brutal, I know I was wrong before. I have a chance, let's start again, okay? You don't have to worry about other people's perspectives, and you don't have to care about what they say. I will treat you well, I will hold you in the palm of my hand, and love you for the rest of my life." The more he said, the more gentle his voice, the generous palms pressed against her head, inch by inch, as if he were treating rare treasures. "Didn't you always want me to treat you well? I don't want anyone in the future, you're the only one. No matter what you want, I will satisfy you. Gu Weil looked at him and shook his head, it's too late. Seeing that Zhao Chenju's expression changed slightly and wanted to get angry, she was not afraid at all. Instead, she smiled, you always do this. You have to wait until there is no room for change before you know you regret it. Zhao Chenju changed his face. He opened his mouth to explain, but couldn't say anything. Gu Weil didn't seem to care what he was thinking. Turning his head, letting the wind and snow hit him, he looked at the plum blossoms outside again. When he left, he told me that he would pick the plum blossoms with my back every winter, even if he was old. I can't move my back, and I'll be holding my hand. She smiled. Looking at Baixu on his shoulders, he turned his gaze on the tablet that was covered with a layer of white snow. I didn't know what he thought of, and said with an infatuation, if the snow falls on his head, he is considered a whitehead. Do you like him so much? Zhao Chenju gritted his teeth behind him. Gu Weil smiled. She remembered the man who stood in front of her when she first saw her, curled his eyebrows and said to her, you were like this before, and you didn't say a word if you were bullied. He smiled and cried, yes, I like him so much. Really like? She couldn't help it, tears falling down her cheeks, and she cried softly, I like it so much. Gu Weil. I'm not allowed. Zhao Chenju's furious voice sounded in the room, but before he finished speaking, he discovered that the woman who had stood in front of him with her back straight suddenly fell backwards. He was startled, but quickly stretched out her hand. Took her into her arms. What happened to you? His voice is full of doubts. As soon as he finished speaking, he saw a trace of blood flow from the corner of Gu Weil's mouth. Zhao Chenju's eyes widened. He seemed to guess something, and his lips were trembling. You. His eyes were red, not knowing he was out of anger. She was still crying, shaking her hands to wipe the corners of her mouth, but the blood couldn't be wiped clean no matter how she wiped it. He seemed to be crazy, and while rubbing it, he furiously said, go to the doctor, go and find the doctor for me. The door was opened and Wang Zhao walked in. She stared at the picture blankly, and then Bai Lu screamed, Madam, what's the matter with you? Zhao Chenju hugged Gu Weil like this, with red eyes, and kept saying, don't die. It's pretty brutal, don't die, don't leave me. I forbid you to die. Gu Weil ignored his voice. She just held the tablet and put it firmly in her heart. In fact, her consciousness was a little unclear. She seemed to see Li Qingyuan in a trance. He was standing by her. In front of him, a look of helplessness and pity. She laughed suddenly. He stretched out his hand, towards the figure, smiled and said, General, take me home. Why isn't the lady awake yet? I blame Miss Biao. If it weren't for her and young Master Zhao, Miss wouldn't have been so angry that she would fall into the lake. Okay, don't say anything. We are at the Wang's house. If the uncle's wife heard it, I'm afraid it would be unhappy again. She doesn't know how to raise her own daughter. Even if her daughter robs her cousin's fiancé, she is still upset. It's just that our young lady is staying in their Wang's house alone to be confident. Red Frost. The woman who had spoken earlier raised her voice. She is usually more dignified. Now that her voice rang, the room was immediately cleaned up. After a while, she slowed her voice again and continued, You are not biased by what you said. Mrs. Uncle is Mrs. Uncle. Miss has lived in Wang's house for so many years, and Mrs. Uncle has always treated her very well. If you don't talk about her, which one of the uncle and the old lady is not spoiled by the young lady? If your words can be passed on, wouldn't you be poking their hearts? Hong Shuang probably also knew that she had made a mistake, and she didn't dare to say it anymore. Just looking at the woman lying inside, she couldn't help but whispered angrily, I'm just angry. Bai Lu followed with a sigh. Gu Weil's mind was a little confused as he listened to the voice outside. Her consciousness is still a bit unclear, and she can't really hear the words outside, but only faintly heard Bai Lu's voice. Could it be? She was rescued again? Gu Wei lightly folded his eyebrows in his chaotic sleep, feeling a little upset. What's the use of saving her? Li Qingyuan is dead, and her last thoughts in this world are gone. It's better to be dead than to be alive. But the very red frost-like voice at the back made her startled. Hong Shuang was married a few years ago, how could she appear in her house? Isn't she going to take poison and scare Hong Shuang back in Suzhou? No matter what it was, Gu Wei wrung a pair of eyebrows, finally willing to open his eyes. The goal is not the azure bed net she is familiar with, but the flashy brocade embroidered with big red peonies. After marrying Li Qingyuan, she no longer loves these flowery things. At this time, she looked at everything that was familiar and unfamiliar. His expression was slightly startled, and he always felt something was wrong. He turned his gaze to the outside again. An arhut bed with red sandalwood lacquer heart and 100 treasures inlaid with flowers, topped with begonia red embroidered chrysanthemum pattern brocade, and a few mink velvet pillows behind it. Behind the arhut bed is a white jade seat screen, which is full of height for a person. 2 people wide, with only a few drops of ink painted on it, is the cleanest thing in the house. In the middle of the luhan bed, there is a coffee table. Apart from fruits and other objects, there is also a tall vase with blue sea and sky standing there, with a few branches of Aoxuhanmei in it, stretching out wantonly. Looking aside, there is a bogo shelf near the small tic-tac-toe window. There are a lot of rare things on it, such as corals, pearls with the size of a baby's fist, and telescopes sent from the west. The shelf is also placed right in front of the shelf. There is a long table with a gukkan on it. On the other side is a hollow lacquer lotus incense burner. At this time the fragrance is curling up through the hollowed out places. Each of these furnishings in the house is a treasure and good thing, and even a small gilt incense ball is worthy of a poor family for several years. But the more Gu Wei looked at it, the more shocked he became. This is not a bit similar to the house she lives in now, but it is exactly the same as the house she lived in Lan Zhiwang's house when she was young. What is the problem? She stared at these with her eyes open and didn't notice someone coming in from outside with the curtain. The person here was Bailu. She was holding the medicine in her hand. Seeing Gu Wei with her eyes open, she didn't react for a while. After a long pause, she swiftly walked, and said in surprise, "Miss, are you awake?" Hearing this movement outside, he suddenly became excited and hurried in his footsteps, and immediately many people walked in. In the repeated voice of young lady, Gu Wei raised his eyes and looked over, and his eyes were all familiar figures. But her face was dazed, she still didn't react. Bailu didn't think much about it when she woke up from a serious illness, and said, "Go to the doctor, and then talk to the old lady and the uncle. Only Miss Dao is awake, so they can rest assured." The maids were ordered to leave. Quickly. There are not many people in the house. Bai Lu was sitting on the round stool in front of the bed with red eyes, and her voice sounded a little dumb. "You have been asleep for several days, and now you are finally awake. If you don't wake up again, what do you do if you let the slaves?" Gu Wei stared at her in a dazed manner. It was Bailu, but not the Bailu she had remembered. The Bailu in front of her was not combing a woman's bun, and her face looked very young, unlike a woman of 30, but 15. 6 look. She was really dumbfounded. "I don't understand why I woke up like this. What's wrong with me?" She heard her voice hoarse when she exited. Seeing this, Bai Lu was busy pouring a cup of warm water and handing it to her. While serving her to use it, she said in a shocked voice, "You have forgotten." Before anyone could say, she answered, "How many times are you first? I will see young Master Zhao and Miss Biao." She pursed her lips and waited in a gentle way, standing in one place. When she stepped forward, she accidentally stumbled and fell into the lake. "Young Master Zhao, Miss Biao?" Gu Wei was dumbfounded, and it took a long time to realize what Bai Lu was talking about. It was a long, long time ago. About when she was 15 years old, one day when she was walking through the garden, she saw Wang Zhao and Zhao Qinzhu hugged together. Wang Zhao was still crying in Zhao Qinzhu's arms, and she was wronged by the heavens. Look like. Although Wang Zhao said afterwards that he accidentally fell, thanks to Zhao Qinzhu's support. But she was still very angry. Zhao Qinzhu is her fiancé, how can she allow him to hug other women? Regardless of Wang Zhao being her cousin, she wanted to step forward and pull the person away, but her luck was so bad that she tripped over a stone before she stepped forward and fell straight into the lake. When she was young, she had a coquettish temperament, and she could not be wronged the most. Relying on her own favor, she started to make trouble when she woke up. If she remembers correctly, Wang Zhao was sent to the family temple that time and didn't come back until she married Zhao Qinzhu. And so with a move of Gu Weiyu's finger in the quilt, she looked at this familiar environment and at the familiar person in front of her, her pupils shrunk slightly, but her heart beat violently, like a firework exploding. The nails pinched the palms of his hands severely. She opened her eyes that burst into tears from the pain until the pain came from her heart. Really? Not a dream. So, did she go back to the past, back to the 20th year of Kingxi, back to when she was 15? There was a sudden sound of footsteps outside, followed by a slightly old voice, "My dear." The curtain was pulled apart, and an old woman in sandal-colored Chinese clothes was helped away. When she came in, she wore a forehead embedded with red gems, and her slightly tired face was full of anxiety. I was relieved to see that the woman who had been sleeping in bed for many days really woke up. Bai Lu hurriedly stepped aside and invited someone to come and sit. Madame Wang looked at Gu Weiyu, who was pale, her eyes flushed. She sat on the chair and held her hand, choked up and said, "You want to stay awake again, you want me? How can you explain to your dead mother? There are not many grandchildren and granddaughters under her knees, but her granddaughter is the only one who loves her the most, because her poor granddaughter had no mother when she was born. She pitied her in her heart, and when she was young, she took people to her side and raised them herself." Seeing the little girl who had been proud and bright since she was a child, now she was lying on the bed with a pale face, Madame Wang and Lao's heart was gripped, and the tears in her eyes became more intense. "Grandma." Gu Weiyu stared at the graceful old woman in front of him. Although he had guessed it, when she really saw the figure of her grandmother, her tone of voice still became a little weird because of shock. Without waiting for others to react, she suddenly threw herself into the arms of Mrs. Wang. The tears just couldn't stop, and the strings fell down, and the voice was mixed with crying, which unreservedly vented her longing for so many years. She didn't say anything, she couldn't say anything, she just hugged people, kept crying and shouting the words grandmother. The people in the room were stunned to see her like this. Who doesn't know that this young lady is the most proud of them on weekdays? The kind of temperament that would rather bleed than cry, but now cry so badly, as if he was wronged by heaven. Reminiscent of those things that happened a few days ago, everyone's eyes were a little red. Mrs. Wang was taken aback by her. She noticed that her shoulder was wet from crying. She felt sorry and angry again. The anger she had suppressed earlier would come out again, and she sternly shouted at the person behind her, "Go call me that bastard." This is naturally Wang Zhao. The maids and maids all hesitated. The third lady knelt in the ancestral hall for 3 days, and her knees were swollen. She was picked up by her wife today. If she was fined another time, she still wondered what it would look like. Hong Shuang wanted to volunteer to call people over. It would be better for the old lady to scold her, so as to vent her feelings, but Gu Weiyu responded in time and persuaded Mrs. Wang. She wiped away her tears, and said to others in a dumb voice, "Grandma, stop shouting, I have something to say to you." Mrs. Wang and Lao naturally took her opinion as the main reason. Seeing this, she didn't let people shout again. She drove everyone out according to Gu Weiyu's words, and then asked, "Man, you say, you want what do you want? Grandma will satisfy you no matter what you want. She was solemn and majestic throughout her life, but she lost her daughter in her middle-aged age, and now she gives Gu Weiu all her love. Naturally, whatever she wants, she is satisfied. Gu Weiu remembered that his grandmother had said this to her in his impression. What did she get back then? She said that she didn't want to see Wang Zhao. The grandmother obeyed her and sent Wang Zhao to the family temple, but it also hurt her aunt, who always treated her as a daughter. Later, when her grandmother passed away, she was not happy in Zhao's family. Her family was far away, and the only uncle who could rely on was also born with her because of the past. Now think about it, for the sake of one Zhao Chenju, she hurt her relatives. My heart is really unnecessary. In fact, she didn't hate Wang Zhao for a long time. Even for Zhao Chenju, she didn't have any extra thoughts. She just wanted to find her general quickly. Grandma. Gu Weiu looked at her with a firm and calm expression. I want to divorce. What? Mrs. Wang opened her eyes wide and her face was in disbelief. She frowned and looked at her carefully for a long time, but in the end she still held Gu Weiu's hand and sighed in a low voice, You are so brutal. Too much sadness? If your grandmother knows this, you are upset, and you have grievances in your heart. There is nothing wrong with it. So what you want to do, Grandma will do what you want. She is not one of those foolish old women who are dull and unbearable when she gets older. How can she not see through Wang Zhao's thoughts and tricks? However, she didn't go to reveal it because she cared about the face of her girl's family and the reputation of the Wang family. If you don't want to see her, your grandmother will send her to the family temple and send her back when you are married to Zhao Chenju, okay? Mrs. Wang really hurt Gu Weiu to her bones. When she said this, she didn't care whether her son or daughter-in-law would be sad, and whether her granddaughter would hate her in the future, she just wanted to make her happy. After these words, she brought Gu Weiu into her arms, just as she did when she was a child, stroking her head, and whispered, It's brutal, marriage is not a child's play, you can't just say such things just because you are angry for a while. Gu Weiu knew that his words would definitely be blocked. At this time in her previous life, she really loved Zhao Chenju too much. The entire Lanja people knew that the Wang family who had come from the capital loved the Zhao family so much that she loved the son of Zhao family. She exhausted her thoughts and repelled one after another she thought potential rivals. To take Zhao Chenju as his own regardless of dignity. No matter what banquet Zhao Chenju attends, she will attend. Whenever a girl gets closer to Zhao Chenju, she will turn her face. Because of Zhao Chenju, she turned herself into a paranoid woman. She thought that Zhao Chenju was only hers. But the facts prove if a man does not have you in his heart, even if you love it humble and low as dust, it will not change his mind, but will make him hate you even more. She thought of Zhao Chenju being mean to her in the past, and suddenly wanted to laugh. If these things were the first thing she thought of when she was separated from Zhao Chenju, it would definitely break her heart, and make her sleepless, but time is really a good thing. Those she thought would be in this life. The resentment and sorrow that will not be forgotten, after years of polishing, have long been forgotten by her. Now, her heart was occupied by one person, and she couldn't tell the least bit of thinking about other people. Gu Weiu nestled in the arms of Mrs. Wang, just like when he was a child, with gently pinching the corner of a person's clothes. Grandma, I don't want to divorce because I am angry for a while. I am serious. She was in her. Lifting her head in her arms, the small face that had been thinned due to illness did not compromise her appearance, but instead made her a little weaker than usual, and people couldn't help but feel pity when they looked at it. You didn't agree with me to marry Zhao Chenju before. Without waiting for Mrs. Wang to speak, Gu Weiu suddenly said something like this, Grandma, can you tell me why? Mrs. Wang was taken aback. After a while, she looked at Gu Weiu and sighed, the child of the Zhao family has a good character and is good at learning. He is also top-notch in terms of temperament, but his family is complicated, and his father is a widow. Although he is a son, his mother died young, and his stepmother and younger brother are capable. If you marry, you will inevitably suffer under their hands. Gu Weil looked at Mrs. Wang's eyes and said, "This is not the most important thing." Seeing Mrs. Wang's expression moved slightly, she continued, "Although the Zhao family is complicated, as long as the Wang family and the Gu family do not fall in a day, they can't do anything to me." "Grandma, I'm right." Mrs. Wang didn't expect Gu Weil to suddenly become so transparent. She frowned and looked closely at her granddaughter for the first time in her life, but finally defeated in her clear eyes. She raised her hand to stroke her hair again, and followed her words and said, "Yes. As long as the Wang family and the Gu family don't fall, no one can take you. I didn't approve of you marrying Zhao Chenju." Just because she said this, her words paused, her eyes looked straight into Gu Weil's eyes, and she continued, "This kid from the Zhao family makes you more and more it's not like you anymore." Although she was proud before, she was not domineering. But since falling in love with the child of the Zhao family, she seems to have changed her personality. She is so paranoid that she is a little crazy. She completely ignores the gazes of others, and does not care what they say. There seems to be only one Zhao Chenju in her eyes, and she has no friends. Regardless of loved ones, good love will make people grow. Instead of loving someone so much that you don't like yourself. And so, she disagrees. "I wanted to tell you before, but you have the Zhao family in your eyes, and I thought that maybe you will get better when you get married in the future, so I didn't stop it anymore." Mrs. Wang said everything in her heart. After coming out, he sighed again. "Finished." Looking at her again, it seems that there is still some doubt. "Man, have you figured it out?" Gu Weil nodded, in the questioning gaze of Mrs. Wang. He shook her hand and said softly, "Grandma, this time I can be regarded as a trip to Guimengwan. The things that I couldn't figure out before are still true." "Figured out? My marriage with Zhao Chenju was originally forced by me. What are you asking for?" Mrs. Wang had listened well, but she was a little unhappy. She curled her lips and interrupted her. "We didn't put the knife on their necks. His father knew we were interested. The next day I had to send Gang Tai over, for fear that we would regret it. Your own children are always the best. Especially for someone who is eccentric like Mrs. Wang, how can you see your precious granddaughter say this?" The smile in Gu Weil's eyes became stronger. She still likes her grandmother. No matter what she does, her grandmother will protect her. She is like stripping away decades of experience in the previous life, like a child. In this long-lost bosom, Yan Yan laughed and said, "Yes, Zhao Chenju doesn't like me, it's his loss." When she was happy, she continued, "No matter what, since Zhao Chenju has no intention of me, I don't have any other thoughts about him now. Instead of going on like this, it's better to stop as soon as possible." Madame Wang looked at her and seemed to hesitate, really think about it. She always felt that it was quite impossible to put it down so simply. But Gu Weil was so calm. She didn't avoid it, so she looked at Mrs. Wang and nodded and said, "Grandma, I really figured it out. It took her so many years to use this. Things figured out. Now to Zhao Chenju. She has neither resentment nor love, and only regards him as a stranger she knows among all the living beings. She didn't want to involve him anymore. No need." Mrs. Wang did not go to Zhao's house to get the Gang Tai back immediately according to Gu Weil's intentions, but this matter was no longer a secret in the Wang's family. No one thought that their cousin was going to be with Zhao's family. The eldest son of Lanzhi retired from marriage. Incredible. I can't believe it. The most unbelievable one is Wang Zhao. This day, with the rare good weather in the winter, Gu Weil is still young and will be raised for a few days, and the illness will be cured. She also plans to leave for Beijing. The first few carriages were all the things Gu Weil used in the past, as well as the things that the Wang family prepared for the Gu family. Although Mrs. Wang doesn't like gujia, she still has to do it decently. 6 carriages. There are more than 20 guards on both sides, along with the maid and the old woman. There are more than 30 people, which can demonstrate Gu Weih's status in the Wang family. This departure is different from the past. Gu Weihe has decided to retire from Zhao Chenju, but in Lanja, it is impossible to find another person like Zhao Chenju who has good family background, character, and talent. Qin let her go back to the capital. It can be said so. When it was time to leave, she still held Gu Weihe's hand and said uncomfortably, "You have gone to the capital, where there are mountains and rivers, and there is no way for your grandmother to take care of you." Gu Weihe felt a little uncomfortable. In her previous life, before the death of her grandmother, she stayed in Lanja. Even if she went to the capital, it was only once a year. Every time she stayed for 7 or 8 days, she packed up her baggage and returned. To her, Lanja was her home, and her grandmother was her closest person. But now, although she was full of dismay, she had to go. Apart from meeting her general earlier, she also wanted to see her relatives far away in the capital. After she and Zhao Chenju left in the previous life, they were taken back to the capital by her father. She still remembers that her father took the imperial decree and rushed to Lanja quickly. When he saw her, 2 lines of tears suddenly fell on his firm face. He knelt in front of her on one knee, his generous hands trembling slightly, stroking her face, said to her, "Yes, I'm late for my father." Later, he took her away from Lanja, and despite Zhao Chenju's obstruction, he beat Zhao Chenju for her life. Her father is actually very good. Only in the past, she had too deep a prejudice against him. She blamed him, hated him, and refused to call him father. Sometimes, she would also think that her father, obviously, as a confidant of the emperor, a great minister of the great Zhou, should live better than anyone else, but in his previous life he died depressed and unhappy at less than 50. Is it because of her? He lost his lover when he was most energetic, and his most cherished daughter in his life was also like him. He had everything but nothing, so he would caress her before dying. Hair, red eyes, and said to her, "It would be nice if you didn't marry your mother, and she wouldn't have died so early. But I still can't bear it." Gu Weihe thought of this, her eyes reddened again. Since the heavens gave her a chance to start again, not only did she find the general earlier, she also wanted to treat her relatives well. After sniffing, she swallowed all the tears back, barely smiled, and said to someone, "No matter how far away, I will come to see you from time to time." Take her general. In her previous life, when she married Li Qingyuan, her grandmother had already passed away. In this life, she wants to take him to see her grandmother earlier. Her general is so good, if her grandmother sees him, she will definitely like him. Mrs. Wang had nothing to do, wiped her tears, and exhorted a few more words. Gu Weihe complied one by one, and when he said goodbye to his uncle and aunt, and to his cousins, it took him a while to get into the carriage. When the carriage was about to depart, someone suddenly stopped calling, "Gu Weihe." It's Wang Zhao's voice. Su did not expect that she would appear. Gu Weihe was stunned before raising the curtain. She saw Wang Zhao being supported by 2 maids and limped towards her. When she saw her, she pushed away the maids. He helped, walked over gritted teeth, stood by the carriage, and asked her, "You just left?" Gu Weihe nodded, "Yet. You?" Wang Zhao bit his lip, his little face full of doubts, "Are you really willing?" Gu Weihe didn't answer her directly this time. Instead, he leaned on the carriage, lowered his eyes, and looked at her seriously. This was the first time she saw Wang Zhao after she woke up, not the one in her memory who would always hold on. It looks graceful and luxurious. She is too immature now. "Do you like Zhao Chenju?" Gu Weihe asked her. Her voice was flat and light, only enough for the 2 of them to hear. Wang Zhao's expression changed, she seemed a little nervous, for fear that others would hear it, but under Gu Weiyu's gaze, she couldn't help but straighten her back, as if afraid of being looked down upon by her. She gritted her teeth and struck her neck. Said, I just like him, so what? Without you, he should have been mine. Had it not been for her grandmother to cherish Gu Weiyu, Zhao Chenjue should have belonged to her. She was the one who deserved him best. Gu Weiyu just looked at her and smiled. It didn't look like she was going to fight with her before. The wind blew her face, she raised her hand to wrap the hair behind her ear, and then looked at Wang Zhao. Feng Qingyun faintly smiled, then, I wish you everything you wish. The wind is strong, I should go, you go back too. Finished. She also ignored Wang Zhao and dropped the curtain. The carriage moved forward slowly, and Wang Zhao watched Gu Weiyu leave blankly, and only curled his eyebrows after a long time. What the was this woman doing? She didn't believe that she would leave so easily. She must have something left behind. After half a month. As the cold winter approaches, the wind and snow are getting worse. Fortunately, Mrs. Wang knew that Gu Weiyu was afraid of the cold, and prepared a lot of fine silver charcoal, but even so, Gu Weiyu was still too cold. Bailu and Hongshuang took the quilt to cover the seams in the carriage. Strictly enough, he took out all the good fox furs who didn't need money, and piled them all on Gu Weiyu's body. Why haven't it arrived yet? Hongshuang complained while rubbing Gu Weiyu's hands. It is estimated that there will be more than half a day's journey. Bai Lu also glanced at Gu Weiyu who was so cold, bit her lip, and suggested, should we rest nearby for a while? The wind and snow are so big, if you go back like this, I'm afraid it will be frozen. Wait for the wind. The snow is getting smaller, let's go again. Gu Weiyu's whole body was shrunk in the fox fur, his teeth were shaking from the cold. She shook her head and just wanted to refuse. She heard Hongshuang say, I remember there is a temple nearby, why don't we go there to rest for a while? Temple? Gu Weiyu had a meal. If she remembers correctly, that temple is Hintai Temple, and it's also the place where she first met Li Kainyuan. Although it was a few years later, her heart moved and she couldn't help but want to go. Take a look. Then go and rest for a while. Because I said it in the same family earlier, I was afraid that my family would wait for a long time. Gu Weiyu asked some maids, women and a few guards to the rest of the carriage back to the government house, and then talked to the family and waited for the wind. The snow stopped, she returned home. As for the others, they went to the temple with her to sit and rest for a while. Perhaps because of the heavy snowfall today, there are no pilgrims in this temple where incense is flourishing on weekdays. There are only a few monks in robes and hats sweeping the snow in front of the door. Seeing them coming in such a big battle still stunned for a while. Bailu held up the umbrella and stepped forward first to explain her intentions. One of the monks put down the broom in his hand, walked to Gu Weiyu, and performed a namaste ceremony. Donor, please come with the little monk. Gu Weiyu nodded, and when she entered, she also looked up at the door plaque with the 3 characters Hintai Temple in gold paint. Somehow, a shallow arc appeared at the corner of her mouth. Bai Lu looked at curious, and when he helped her in, she asked, Miss has never been here before, so how can I look at it? She recalled Gu Weiyu's previous eyes and smiles, and she rarely used to in a weird tone. The word, remember. Probably Gu Weiyu smiled, I've been here in my dream. Hongshuang laughed out loud, bending her eyes, and said with a smile, Miss now loves to talk and laugh more and more. Although Bai Lu didn't say much, there was a smile in her eyes. She also felt that the young lady woke up this time is a little different from the past, she was a lot more open-minded and transparent. Such a change, although some are surprised, but more cheerful. The young lady used to paint herself as a prison, but she knew that she was getting worse and worse by following the young man Zhao. Now that she was willing to let go, it couldn't be better. She took another look at the young lady, and seeing that her eyes were bright and she didn't look resentful in the past, her hanging heart was really let go. The monk led Gu Wiu and others to the meditation room, served hot tea and cakes, and then withdrew. Hong Shuang walked to the side to roast the fox fur soaked by wind and snow for Gu Wiu. Bailu went to help her arrange the bed for her to have a nap. Gu Wiu was always squeamish, and never wronged herself even when she went out, so she every trip has to bring a lot of things. In addition to bed nets and bedding, sometimes even the things for drinking tea and washing hands have to use their own. To this, Gu Wiu did not raise any objections. She has had no worries about food and clothing since she was a child. She lived for more than 30 years and only frustrated after she was separated from Zhao Qinju. Later, she married Li Kainyuan. Although her general had to discipline her everywhere, she never treated her harshly. At most, when I saw her decorate in the same way, I could not help but say, "Why are you so squeamish?" Then continue to sway her. Thinking of Li Kainyuan, Ji Yi's Gu Wiu on the couch couldn't help but smile again. She was looking forward to it. I don't know what the general will look like now. She tilted her head halfway, looking at the vast white snow outside the wooden window lattice, and couldn't help thinking. The temperament of the general, even when he was young, he should be a person who kept his steadiness. The blizzard outside the window is as big as the snow. But Gu Wiu didn't feel cold at all. Her Myali's eyes were crescent-like, and there was a shining radiance that could not be hidden inside. She could even imagine Li Kainyuan's current appearance, sitting in blue clothes. In the study, looking at books that she finds obscure. If you encounter something incomprehensible, you will raise your eyebrows and continue to think, and if you figure it out, you will stretch your eyebrows. When she thinks this way, it seems that she can see Li Kainyuan in her youth appearing in front of her. The corners of the mouth are turned up a little bit. Her general must be a gentleman who is prudent, courteous, and gentle, so many people admire him. The more Gu Wiu thinks about it, the more he wants to see Li Kainyuan sooner. She likes the general, wants to see him earlier, wants to be a baby in his arms, wants to kiss him, hug him, and watch him. Helpless and petting eyes. "Miss." Bai Lu called her several times, only to hear Gu Wiu respond. She reluctantly handed someone a hot kerchief. "What are you thinking? I called you several times." "It's nothing." Gu Wiu shook his head, saying nothing, still very happy. Bai Lu didn't ask any more, and when she removed her hairpin and changed her sleeping clothes, she coaxed people to sleep. It was probably a long journey for half a month. This time, Gu Wiu slept very comfortably. When she woke up, the wind and snow outside stopped. She called someone to come in and wait on her. Bai Lu said to her while dressing for others, "A letter came from home. The old lady is afraid that you will be alone, so she specifically called the third young master to pick you up. It is estimated that it will be there in half an hour." Gu Wiu nodded. She glanced out the window, and she couldn't see anything in the whiteness, but she didn't hear the wind, so she asked, "Has the snow stopped?" "Yes, you stopped shortly after you fell asleep." Bai Lu smiled. "I'm going to look outside. Gu Wiu hasn't been here for a few years. The plum garden here is a must. She wants to see it. If possible, she also wants to pick some plum blossoms and make a sachet." Good day to the general. Her current female celebrity is a lot more superb than before, and she will never make that crooked look again and make him laugh. "I'll accompany Miss." Hong Shuang volunteered. Bai Lu didn't stop them either, but when she was wearing fox fur for Gu Wiu, she softly warned, "Although the snow has stopped, it's still cold this day. Don't go to the tree to throw the snow like before. Play." After finishing speaking, she reminded Hong Shuang like an incessant old mother, "You have to take good care of Miss, don't make a fuss with you." Hong Shuang grinned, "Bailu, you are too long-winded, see who will marry you in the future." After speaking, he pulled the decently dressed Gu Wiu out, regardless of Bailu's back, and said, "Slow down, don't fall." After the snow stopped, the sky was still smog, and the eyes were all white. The tree is white, the ground is white, and the eaves are white. Only the towering stupa not far away reveals a little golden light. Miss, where are we going? Hong Shuang asked her. Gu Wei looked at a place and smiled, look at the plum blossoms. Okay. At this time, in another meditation room, the house burning with charcoal fire was like warm spring. An old man in cassock was sitting cross-legged on the futon. He was the abbot of Hintai Temple. He did not open his eyes when he heard someone push the door. He waited for a while. Juxiang opened his eyes not angry, and cursed, Babbitt, are you drinking again? The man here is dressed in white, phoenix eyes, and his hair is combed into a ponytail. It is Li Kainyuan when he was young. Hear the words. Li Kainyuan paused. He looked at the old man with an angry face, and a smile appeared on the handsome and unparalleled peach blossom face. Old man, you didn't sleep? Because I was afraid of disturbing you, I lightened my footsteps. After he finished, he went straight to once on the ground, the right leg was placed on the left knee, with his hands resting on the back of his head, there was a slight tap on the toes. It's completely unruly. No matter how many times have you been to this school, how many times have you been to this school since it has been in school for so long, but this kid didn't listen to it, and it's useless to scold him. Stay with me, do you want to become a monk? Isn't it good to be a monk? Li Kainyuan closed his eyes, pulled his lips, and smiled nonchalantly, when I can't hang on any more, I will come to you to beg for food. Little 7 Li Kainyuan knew that the old man was going to preach again when he heard this name. He opened his eyes helplessly and looked at the old man on the couch. Old man, why are you so annoying now? He stood up directly after he said it. Walked out, I'll go find Ruhuai and the others to play. Little 7. Even if you hate your father again, don't you even care about your grandmother? Yawuze sighed behind him. Li Kainyuan almost walked to the door. Hearing this, his footsteps stopped. He put his hand on the door and walked out without saying anything for a while. Lu Wu looked at him like this, shook his head, and sighed again. After Li Kainyuan was 10 years old, he lived in this Hintai temple for most of the time. I am afraid that even the monks in the temple are incomparable to the level of familiarity with this temple. He walked along the long corridor outside of the temple. He didn't know where to go, just like an unconscious ghost, wandering everywhere. Su felt this was a bit boring. Li Kainyuan turned to the kitchen and took a pot of sake for offering sacrifices. Then he directly picked a temple with a higher temple and turned it over. After a day of snow, the glazed tiles were covered with snow. He swept it away and leaned directly on the tip. The corner of the canopy sat down. Although the snow stopped, the wind was still a bit strong. But he seemed to be unconscious, and even if the wind hit his face, he just half squinted and raised his head to drink. The old man's wine is really awful as always. Li Kainyuan smiled, but still raised his head to continue drinking, and when he finished drinking a pot of wine, he closed his eyes. He flexed his foot, stretched his foot forward, tapped the brick with his empty hand, and opened his eyes drunkenly until a laugh came from underneath. Miss, why do we pick so many plum blossoms? It's not that there aren't none at home. Hong Shuang asked in confusion. It's not the same. Gu Wei smiled and shook her head, still tiptoe to pick the plum blossoms on top of her head, fearing that the snow on the branches might hit herself. She wore a hood, only showing a pointed chin, but raised her head. When picking the plum blossoms, you can still see a pair of smiling eyes like stars. She is naturally afraid of cold. At this time, because she wanted to make a sachet for her general, she endured coldness and picked the buds on the branch. Why is it different? Are they all plum blossoms? Hong Shuang still didn't understand, and muttered softly, but her biggest advantage was that she didn't think deeply about what she wanted to do. When Gu Wei answered, she also helped pick up the plum blossoms. Gu Wei looked at her and smiled, of course it was different. Hintai Temple was the place where she and the general met for the first time. Later they got married, and Li Qingyuan took her hand and revisited her old place and asked her to make a sachet for him. She was not so beautiful since she was a child, for fear that he would laugh. She blushed and turned down. But her general, a man as dignified as usual, acted like a child that day and acted like a baby with her. She looked up at the plum blossoms on top of her head, her brows and eyes curled, and the corners of her mouth couldn't help but tilt up. "Miss, the third young master is here, we should go now." Bailu's voice came not far away. Gu Wei glanced at the plum blossoms on the handkerchief, weighed that it was enough, and smiled. Li Qingyuan held his head with his hands and tilted his head. His long and narrow eyes looked at the figure of Gu Wei who was going away. He watched her gorgeous cloak transform into a colorful color in the vast world, and watched her hide in his pocket. The face under the hat was full of pure smiles. He smiled, as if it had nothing to do with him, and continued to sleep with his eyes squinted. He opened his eyes, leaned down, and smiled. "What's the matter? Little master, you are drinking again." The little monk below was very upset with a puffed face. Li Qingyuan smiled and turned down and stood in front of Ruhui, bent down, and flicked his forehead with his hand. "Wrong, I am borrowing, the old man's wine is too awful, I will give some to the Buddha in a few days, it's delicious." Ruhui held his forehead, angrily. "Isn't it still in your stomach in the end?" "Well..." Li Qingyuan thought for a while. It seemed like this, so he didn't say more. He threw the wine flask in his hand to Ruhui, and walked forward with his hands behind his head. He turned his head and asked Ruhui, "Which family? I heard that it is a lady from Dingguo Gongfu. That lady is so rich, she donated a lot of silver to our temple, and she looks good." Ruhui followed Li Qingyuan and kept saying, "Gu's?" Li Qingyuan met Guyu and Guyu, but he had never met the person just now. Thinking of the daughter of the Gu family who had been raised in Lanja since childhood, Ruhui was still saying beautiful and kind behind him. The beauty is true and kind, he smiled when he thought of the things that Fu Xian and him complained about. Somewhat non-committal. Dingguo Gongfu. It's time to apply. Since the snow stopped at midday, the wind has gradually decreased. Although the outside is still white, the hazy sky has finally revealed some bright colors. In the main courtyard where Mrs. Gu lives, women in thick coats are sweeping snow in the courtyard. The maids under the porch are so red with cold, they still stand well, even if there is no one here. Staring, but none of them was lazy, even their mouths were tightly closed, and they didn't say a word. It can be seen that the rules are very strict on weekdays. The atmosphere outside the yard is very quiet, and there is the same silent atmosphere across a sandal-colored curtain embroidered with a red ground quadruple ruyi pattern. Sitting underneath are the female family members of the mansion. Sitting on the right side is a 30-year-old woman. She is wearing a red makeup-sleeved jacket and a green satin skirt. Her hair is piled up in a wishful bun. Feng Chai wears it diagonally. Although she is not good in appearance, she looks good. Correctly, with clear eyes, there is an unstoppable heroic spirit between the eyebrows. This woman was named Fu Zhang, and she was Gu Wuji's successor to Dingguo Gong, and she was also the mistress of Dingguo Gong's mansion today. And the Lu family sitting opposite her, Lu Yemei and Guzi Face, looked very savvy, dressed in makeup and jade, piled up with pearls and turquoise, and there were 2 pure gold bracelets on his white wrists. They looked like they were better than Fu Zhang. A bit more expensive. The atmosphere in the room is strangely quiet. Both the maid and the mother-in-law have their heads down. She is accustomed to being a busy person. This will put the tea in her aside and gossiping boringly. "It's almost 2 hours since this, how come Xiao hasn't come back?" Could it be she slipped her eyes and fell on Fu Zhang, chuckling softly, "Don't you want to come again?" Fu Zhang was drinking tea. Hearing this, he took a pause in his hand, and then said indifferently, "Brother Rong personally picks it up." How can Xiao not come back? It's snowy today, and there may be delays on the road. It's hard to tell. Liu squinted and smiled. Isn't our Xiao never done anything like this? But... She paused, and then asked, how long does she want to live this time? It's usually New Year's Day. I just came back, now it's the New Year's Day. Fu Zhang frowned when he heard this. She couldn't drink the tea anymore, she put it aside, looked at Liu's, and curled her eyebrows and said, what do the third siblings mean? This is Xiao's home. Naturally, she can live as long as she wants. Seeing her like this, Lu couldn't help but sigh softly. She didn't believe that Fu Zhang was really happy that Gu Weiu came back. In the past, when the child came back, how did she make her family happy? That child, just as if he had thorns all over his body, whoever touched him would suffer. Of course. It was Fu Zhang and her son who suffered the most. Thinking of the harsh words that the bright-looking girl had said, if she were Fu Zhang, I would have hated Gu Weiu in my heart. But no way. Who will let Gu Weiu fate? Behind him was not only a king's family as a backer, but also an aunt who was a queen. She was sealed as the princess when she was still in her infancy. Even their Dingguo Duke made people hurt their eyes. It's useless if you can't understand it, you can only endure it. She smiled and fiddled with the gold bracelet on her wrist. She wanted to stab Fu Zhang a few more words. Mrs. Gu, who was sitting on Luhan's bed, suddenly spoke, Xiao Wu won't leave this time. As soon as these words fell, the smile on Liu's face was a meal. She turned her head to the old lady on the arhut bed, who was wearing a red sandalwood color, closed her eyes and holding a rosary, looked at it, and said in astonishment, what? Thinking about the letter sent 10 days ago, she continued incredulously, could it be true? Xiao Wu really retired from the Zhao family. No one answered her. Mrs. Gu closed her eyes as usual, holding the rosary, her peaceful face seemed to always be so silent. Fu Zhang didn't speak even more. Although she is Gu Wei's stepmother, she can't control her affairs. The Lu clan seemed to be immersed in his great consternation, and murmured, what is she thinking? The good-natured is about to divorce? What kind of character is the Zhao family, she is willing to? I think she is the bigger and the bigger now. It's shameful. She hasn't finished speaking yet. Mrs. Gu opened her eyes. She is now 55, but her eyes are clear, and her face without a trace of smile looks very serious. She just opened her eyes and looked at the Lu family without saying a word. He just let Lu Shishan's mouth shut. When Lu was quiet, the room was quiet for a while. Mrs. Gu fiddled with the rosary in her hand again, and said lightly, this is a foregone conclusion, and you don't need to talk about it in the future. Family law serves. Fu Zhang responded hurriedly, yes. Xiao Wu is the decent daughter of our Gu's family. This is her home. If you don't have eyelids in the future, don't bring it up and say it. Although there was no name and surname, it was clearly addressed to the Lu family. The Lu family was stared at by Mrs. Gu for a while, only to feel that his hair was piercing and his face turned pale. Where would he dare to say anything? He lowered his head, and responded softly like a quail. On the official road at this time, Gu Weiu had been sitting for so long, and she couldn't sit still anymore. She was wrapped in a cloak, leaning on a carriage, holding a sachet full of plum blossoms in her hand, and yelled out softly, 3 brothers. After a while, there was a sound of horseshoes, followed by a melodious male voice into the carriage, what's the matter? Gu Weiu bored and said, how long will it take for us to arrive? Quickly, you will be here after turning this corner. Gu Rong smiled outside, this will be less windy. If you can't sit still, open the curtain and look outside. If you haven't come back for so long, you probably should have forgotten it. What does it look like here? Gu Yuxian moved his heart. She has forgotten about her memories when she was young, but she has not forgotten the memories of Li Qingyuan at all. Is the current capital the same as the future capital? She stretched out 3 fingers and quietly opened a corner of the car curtain to look out. The snow stopped. There were no people on the street, and even the shops were mostly closed, but she still looked outside with interest. It was indeed very different from what she remembered. There were familiar and unfamiliar ones. She remembered that Sun Ji Scissors was next to a Dehua shop, but now it is a bookstore. It is estimated that it will take a few more years to open. The bean curd shop tastes very good. When Li Kainyuan brought her here for the first time, she still disliked it. What kind of delicious food could be made in this shop? It was only after being coaxed to take a bite. Then, her eyes widened. After that, she would pull Li Kainyuan over every time she came out, and she would have to eat 2 large bowls back and forth. I don't know how many times she was ridiculed as little cat. Thought of this. Gu Weiyu's face couldn't help but smile again. Gu Rong is right next to the carriage. It's strange to see her like this. His little cousin used to have a small face every time she came back. She didn't like to laugh no matter how funny she was, as if she was completing a task every time. I came home once in the year, and hurried back to Lanja after the new year. Today, I have been laughing all the time, and I feel good looking at it. He held the reins in hand, lowered his head, and smiled with her. Xiao Wu looks different this time. There was nothing strange on Gu Weiyu's face. He just retracted his gaze when he heard this, raised his head and smiled at Gu Rong. Does the third brother think it is good or bad? Gu Rong was startled, and half a moment later, he wiped a smile on that warm face. He raised his hand and patted Gu Weiyu's hood lightly, as if he was stroking her head. It was good before. But this is better. He is probably the Gu family, the only one who is close to Gu Weiyu. Although everyone said that Xiao Wu was domineering, Gu Rong always remembered that she was sitting on a high bed when she was a child, because she couldn't reach the floor because her toes couldn't reach the bed, and she was crying with red eyes. The little girl was so proud that she deliberately made a small face when she saw him go in, disguising her soft side like a little hedgehog, using a hard shell to face outsiders, but at that time she was still too young. I couldn't hold back a cry and hiccup. Then he remembered her flushed face, followed by the cry of embarrassment that rang through the house. The more Gu Rong thinks about it, the more the smile on his face grows stronger. His gentle eyes face Gu Weiyu, and what dangles in it is the care and compassion that a brother should have. Probably because of this memory when he was young, no matter how bad his little cousin's reputation is, he still can't help but want to treat her better and better. The carriage has turned a corner. He glanced at the sachet that Gu Weiyu was holding in his hand, thinking of the little girl sitting in the carriage just now holding plum blossoms, and suddenly smiled. Is picking so many plum blossoms, do you want to make sachets? Gu Weiyu smiled and nodded. Gu Rong teased her, for me. Gu Weiyu pursed his lips, his expression looked very hesitant, but in the end he looked at Gu Rong and said, this won't work. I'll do it for the third brother in the future. Gu Rong certainly does not lack such a sachet. Just seeing her look like this, he can't help but want to tease her. If you don't give it to me, who are you going to give it? Although he doesn't care about family affairs on weekdays, he also knows his little the cousin has retired from the Zhao family. Is it true that the retiring is false? Is this sachet made for Cho Seung-gu? If this is the case, it is possible. The rest of the family may not know it, but when he went to Lanja to visit Gu Weiyu last year, he saw his cousin get along with Zhao Qinju. Given how happy Xiaowu is with Zhao Qinju, maybe retiring is just her expedient measure? Gu Weiyu didn't know what Gu Rong was thinking. She grabbed the sachet and opened her mouth to say to the general, but not to mention that Li Kainyuan is only a teenager now, that is, her relationship with him. She blushed, so she had to act like a baby, and planned to confuse her. Brother 3. Gu Rong withdrew his mind from his thoughts and saw her delicate and shy appearance. The more he thought about it, the more likely he was. He wanted to ask a few more questions, but it was really about his daughter's family. After the battle, helplessly said, "Well, good, I won't ask." The siblings talked again. When approaching the Kuagong mansion, Gu Weiu suddenly whispered, "Brother, brother. What's happenin'?" "You know." Gu Weiu was a little shy. "Li Kainyuan." "Who?" Gu Rong didn't know if he heard clearly, or did not hear clearly, turned his head and asked her. Its Gu Weiu was still a little shy in her heart. This was the first time she had talked about her generals since she woke up. She bowed her head, blushed, and her slender fingers were holding the sachet tightly, her heart full of shy and embarrassed, even that heart beats a little fast. Bang 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 bang, like the sound of firecrackers on New Year's Eve. Li Kainyuan from the palace of the state of Wei, he. Gu Weiu raised his head shyly, looked at her third brother, and asked, "Third brother, do you know him? Why did you ask about him suddenly?" Gu Rong heard clearly this time. He frowned, his always warm and smiling face was a little strange, and it seemed a bit disgusting. Gu Weiu stared blankly, some did not understand what was going on. The general in her memory is highly powerful and very popular. Even her father praised him. In her impression, it seemed that no one disliked the general. They all respected him, loved him, and even many people treat him as a god. But why did the third brother show such an expression, with disgust and disdain, as if he didn't even want to mention the name? Gu Rong is also in doubt. He didn't understand why his little cousin, who had been living in Lanja, suddenly asked the Li family whether he was stingy. It stands to reason that Xiao Wu should have never seen him before. Why did he mention this name as soon as he came back, and? Gu Rong recalled how Xiao Wu had just talked about Li Kainyuan, she was completely shy of her daughter's family. He frowned, his eyes fixed on Gu Weiu, and he checked all the possibilities in his heart. He didn't know what to think of, and suddenly he held Gu Weiu's arm and asked calmly, "Did you just be at Hintai Temple?" "I saw him, what did he do to you?" Gu Rong used to be a laughter, but now he has a serious expression. Gu Weiu was taken aback by his appearance. After a while, he said, "No, I didn't see him." If she saw the general at the temple just now, how could she come back so easily? It must be followed. Gu Rong didn't believe it, and looked at Bailu and Hongshuang behind Gu Weiu. The two girls were obviously frightened by his appearance. How old is Bailu? This will also sink his face, pull a hand of red cream, and ask in a low voice, "What did you see with the young lady just now?" "People." Hongshuang recovered and shook her head hurriedly, "No, just a few monks, no one else." When Gu Rong heard the words, the expression on his face eased. He breathed a sigh of relief and let go of Gu Weiu. Seeing her small face blankly, only when she was frightened, he softly coaxed, "Little Five, don't blame the third brother." Nervous, Li Qi has always been stubborn, and the third brother is afraid that you will be bullied. Gu Weiu still stayed blankly, without speaking. She was not scared by Gu Rong's appearance, but by his words. "Li Qi has always been stubborn, and the third brother is afraid that you will be bullied. Isn't she auditory hallucinations?" Third brother said that this person is, the general? Isn't it someone with the same name and surname as the general? But it's impossible to think about it, not to mention that the surname Li is noble, let alone coincidence, it will not be coincident that the rankings are the same. Gu Rong Naxiang is still saying, "The third brother doesn't know where you heard the name, but it's better for you to have less contact with this person. He has inherited Confucius and Mencius etiquette since childhood, and he is a gentleman. I still can't do anything bad." After hesitating several times, he just patted Gu Weiu's head with his hands, and sighed, "The left and right third brothers will not harm you." Gu Weiu was even more confused when he heard this. She didn't understand why the respected and beloved general in her memory was actually like this to the third brother. In the end, what went wrong? Gu Rong wanted to say more, but the Kuagong mansion had arrived. He glanced at Gu Weiu, and temporarily suppressed his thoughts. "Miss, it's time for us to get off the carriage." Bai Lu glanced at Gu Wiu, whose expression was not so good, and gently pulled down her sleeve. "Okay." Gu Wiu returned to his senses and replied softly. "No matter what, please go and please your grandmother first. As for the general's matter, let me check it later." Although the third brother has never lied to her, she never believes that the general is such a person. There must be a problem. Main hall. Gu Wiu kowtowed to Mrs. Gu, and greeted Fu Zhang and Liu's family again, and then stood listening to Mrs. Gu's instruction. Mrs. Gu squeezed the rosary in her hand, still the same as before, and her attitude was neither enthusiastic nor indifferent. "You are tired along the way. You should be eating in my yard tonight, but I'm not physically fit these days. It's so comfortable. If you don't eat with me, you should go back to your house for dinner." "Yes." Gu Wiu answered softly, not knowing what he thought of, and then said, "My grandmother has prepared a lot of medicinal materials, and there is a medicine that you took in the past. I will send it to you when I look back." She spoke ordinary, but the people in the room were dumbfounded. Not to mention Fu Zhang and Liu's, even Mrs. Gu, who has always had little emotional fluctuations, seldom stopped pinching the rosary, raised the end of her eyes and glanced at Gu Wiu. After a while, she nodded, her tone of voice was faint. Said, "You have a heart." She seemed to be tired, and she didn't seem to want to say any more. Without a few words, she said, "Well, I should see you all. Your father will be back at night. As for your second sister, seventh sister, and your ninth younger brother Shang in the school, I don't expect to see each other until tomorrow. Okay, you all go back." She didn't pay attention to them after she finished speaking. She was helped to get up and went to the inner room. The people who stayed were naturally sent off again, waiting to see no one before they got up. Gu Rong had greeted Mrs. Gu before and went to work. He did not take the road of imperial examination, but took care of the Gu family's property. He usually had a lot of things and was not easy. In this room, apart from the maid and the old woman, there are only Gu Wiu, Fu Zhang, and the Lu family. Compared with Fu Jiang's uncomfortable feeling when facing Gu Wiu, Liu's family held Gu Wiu's hand very affectionately and sighed, "Poor, how come you have lost so much? I heard that you were Lanja fell into the lake when he was in the lake. Is his body okay now?" Gu Wiu nodded and withdrew his hand. "Aunt Lao cares, I'm okay. She is still not used to being so close to people." Lu felt that it was normal when she saw her. Gu Wiu just now suddenly came up with such a caring sentence, which is strangely uncomfortable. She thought, took another look at Fu Zhang, who seemed to be hesitant to come forward and talk, raised her eyebrows, and continued smiling and saying with Gu Wiu, "Your third brother was out on the boat a while ago. Brought back a lot of good things from overseas, you look back and see, what do you like?" Gu Wiu nodded and said nothing. Knowing that she didn't want to speak any more, Bela stepped forward and said to help, "Madam, third madam, Our Lady is coming along this way. If you are tired, the slave will accompany her back to the house to rest. Liu's naturally should be well." Fu Zhang also said, "Go ahead, I have already made people burn the earth dragons, and the bed nets and quilts have been replaced with new ones." She didn't have a disguised concern, and she wanted to say more. A few words, but thinking of Gu Wiu's reactions in the past, for fear of annoying her, he was busy and stopped. Although Gu Wiu had more experience for a lifetime, she still didn't get along well with others. She was like this in her previous life. She couldn't speak or be a human being. She always offended many people invisibly, and felt that Fu Zhang had robbed her mother of her position, so she couldn't help putting on small shoes. But in fact, Fu Zhang did nothing wrong. Her mother went early, leaving only her bloodline. Although there were many cousins in the family, there were no males from the big house, so the grandmother carried them in regardless of her father's wishes. And Fu Zhang was actually very good to her. Over the years, no matter how she contrived or mistreated her, she never treated her harshly. Even if she lied to others and blamed Fu Zhang for her fault, she never said anything. Gu Weiyu couldn't help thinking, if the general would be here, how would he handle such a situation? He would definitely not make the situation so embarrassing like her, but she really couldn't help it. Although her relationship with her stepmother would ease a lot later in the previous life, she was still very awkward and embarrassed when she was alone. He sighed softly in his heart. She missed the general, and the more such things happened, the more she couldn't help thinking about him. Miss Bai Lu was aside and called her softly. Gu Weiyu returned to her senses. She thought for a while, still pursing her lips, and said to Fu Zhang softly, "Thank you." After she finished speaking, she did not care about the dumbfoundedness of the people in the room, and took two of them. The maid walked out. "She is." Lu looked at Gu Weiyu's figure, waited for the people to turn out the curtain, and said, "What's wrong?" Fu Zhang was obviously more stunned than her. For a while, the corners of her mouth could not help but raised. She probably felt that she did not have the demeanor of a mistress in front of a slave servant. She forced the corners of her mouth down, but her inner joy and happy, so she can't suppress it no matter what. Reluctantly said the words to leave first with the Lu family, and couldn't help it when going outside. He pulled his close-fitting maid King Day, and said excitedly, "Did you just hear that?" King Day smiled and said, "I heard that, Miss Wu would like to thank you." Fu Zhang was full of joy, and his voice was uncontrollable. "You remember to ask the kitchen to prepare something she likes. She loves sweet, especially the sweet and sour pork loin. Don't forget the kitchen." King Day answered again and again, seeming to hesitate, and then asked, "Then you are going to take the 9 young masters to have dinner with Grandpa Guo and 5th Miss today?" She would not ask if this was the case before. Everyone knew Miss 5th. "I don't like their wives, and I don't even like young Master Ju. But today..." Gu Weiyu's attitude made King Day couldn't help but want to speak. "You and Grandpa Guo haven't had a meal together for almost a month. Not to mention anything else." Fu Zhang shook his head, his voice weakened. "No, they finally met with father and daughter. I was afraid that I was going to upset them again. Finally, I saw that Gu Weiyu was more polite to her. Don't want to break this hard-won relationship." The other end. Hong Shuang was also asking, "Why is the young lady being so polite to her today?" She frowned and looked puzzled. After speaking, she blinked and whispered, "Miss, is this your newcomer? How to toss people?" Gu Weiyu gave her a helpless look. "No." That Hong Shuang wanted to say more, but Bai Lu interrupted her. She should be calm and sensible. Then she said, "The young lady is right now. She is the mistress after all. In the future, the young lady will stay at Gu's house. When dealing with the female relatives in Beijing, it's okay to have a better relationship with her." "Okay." Gu Weiyu nodded, believing Bai Lu's explanation. "Otherwise, she can't say that I'm actually in my 30s, and I'm no longer the same kid who threw around without candy." Although she still can't look at Fu Zhang as a mother, she won't look like it anymore. Targeted her like that before. But, there is one more thing. She fingered the sachet on her waist, hesitated for a while or opened her mouth. "Hong Shuang, you will help me find out about the son of Li Qi from Wei Qiagong's mansion later." She wants to see how the general responded. Matter, why would the third brother say that to him? Heard this. Both Bai Lu and Hong Shuang stopped. They turned to look at Gu Weiyu, wondering why the lady mentioned this name one after another today. Hong Shuang's mouth is quick, her temper is impatient, and she can't help it. With her mouth open, she asks, "Miss, why are you so curious about this young man Li Qi today? It stands to reason that the young lady stays in Lanja all year round, and she should have never met this young man Li Qi." Although Bai Lu didn't speak, she kept looking at Gu Weiyu, waiting for her to answer. Gu Weiyu pursed his lips, but didn't know how to answer. Some words may not be suspicious if you tell others, but the two maids around her have followed her since childhood, and they can be regarded as inseparable on weekdays. Even if you hide your idea this time, what will you do after that? So after hesitating for a while, she just said, "Don't ask me for now, I will tell you when I have a chance in the future." Miss Hongshuang pouted, somewhat dissatisfied with this answer. Bai Lu glanced at Gu Weiu, and saw her quiet face and red lips pursed. Knowing that she could not speak any more, she gently pulled Hongshuang, turned her head and said to her, "Go, questioning. Be careful at the time, don't let people know that the lady asked you to inquire. This kind of thing. Hongshuang has always been the best at it." Then he nodded and said, "I know." Gu Weiu added, "Remember to ask more clearly and carefully." Such a caring attitude caused the two maids to look sideways. Gu Weiu also knew that he was doing something wrong now, but she couldn't help it, she was too I want to know about the general. Bai Lu and Hongshuang glanced at each other, and there was a lot of doubt in their hearts, but they knew if someone would answer them, so they didn't say anything. Hongshuang chose a reason and turned to the kitchen. It was obvious that the people who went to see the kitchen prepared what food today, but actually went to ask Gu Weiu about Li Kainyuan. Bai Lu accompanied Gu Weiu back to her old home. Gu Weiu's old residence in Gu's home is called the Chosen Star Building. It is located in the east. It is the best place in the Dingguo mansion. There are a lot of precious flowers planted in the yard, and there are also swings. The rockery is 2 stories high. Standing upstairs, leaning against the railing by the window, you can see the entire Dingguo mansion under your eyes, and you can even see the turret of the palace in the distance. Dingguo Guoji has always loved the daughter left behind by his wife. Even though this daughter doesn't like him and stays in Lanja all year round, he still habitually sends all the good things here. This star-picking building is not so much Gu Weiu's bedroom, but rather a treasure chest. Everything in it is invaluable. Even the cloth curtain that has been invaded by wind and frost all day long is also used. It's made from the Jiangnan brocade, 1 inch and 1 gold. The maid and mother-in-law in front of the door had been ordered long ago, and now they are all standing in the yard. Seeing Gu Weiu coming over, they knelt down. The leading mother, whose surname is Meng, is the dowry of Gu Weiu's mother. She has been taking care of the house for Gu Weiu these years. She looked the most excited when she saw Gu Weiu. When people came to her, she knocked her head and choked. Said, "The old slave welcomes the lady back home. Mother, get up quickly." Gu Weiu asked Bai Lu to help him up, and let the rest of the people get up. Why did the young lady lose so much? After Grandma Meng got up, she couldn't help but redden her eyes when she saw Gu Weiu's small appearance now. Bai Lu hurriedly smiled and said, "It's cold outside, mother, let the young lady come in first." Then she interrupted Mother Meng's words, and let Gu Weiu, who had been frozen with a small face, entered the house. The maid knocked the curtain. Mother Meng and Bai Lu accompanied Gu Weiu into the house. There was a ground dragon burning in the room, and as soon as I entered, there was a gust of hot wind on the face. Bai Lu helped Gu Weiu unwrap the fox fur along the way, and smiled, "Everything is good over Lanja, but there is no ground dragon, even if it's in the house. Burning charcoal all day is still overwhelming." After speaking, they laughed with Gu Weiu again. Now the lady doesn't have to wear so many clothes all day long. Gu Weiu smiled and continued to look at her old house. In fact, this house, which she had just visited a while ago, is no different from what she remembered. If she really wants to say there are, it is just that there are a few calligraphy and paintings of the generals missing on the wall. Seeing that she had been staring at the house, Mother Meng said, "Miss, don't worry, the old slave has been guarding. There is nothing missing in this house. In fact, no one in this Gu family dared to enter Gu Weiu's house. Everyone knows her temper. If there is something missing, this little ancestor still doesn't know how to make trouble after coming back." Even the 7th lady in Sanfang, who is greedy for the precious things in this house, dare not dare. Come. Also Mother Meng looked at Gu Wiu, and whispered, Guo Duke will come here from time to time. When she said this, she was especially careful, for fear that her little master would have a black face again. But fortunately, Gu Wiu didn't have a black face. She even asked softly, how is he, physical? Mother Meng was taken aback, who? It took a while to react, his face was full of shock, and the words were squashed, okay, okay. Bai Lu knew that Gu Wiu was a little different now from the past. Looking at the shocked look of Mother Meng, she smiled and said, Grandma, let someone bring water in. Gu Wiu loves cleanliness. Even in winter, he takes a bath every day. When they used to be in Lanja, they were afraid that she would be frozen, and it would take a lot of time each time. Now back to the capital. It's much easier to handle the heat in the room. Okay, I'll let people prepare. Mother Meng had recovered a bit at this meeting, and she had a bit of shock and turned around and went outside to give orders. After bathing, Gu Wiu was wearing a single coat, leaning on the couch, letting Bailu wipe her hair for her. Hong Shuang looked a little absent-minded before Hong Shuang came back. Bai Lu didn't notice when she was sitting behind her, she only spoke to her in a gentle voice, Miss is going to live for a long time when she comes back. You didn't like to interact with family members before, and you won't be the same in the future. She and Hong Shuang were personally trained by Mrs. Wang and Lao to give them to Gu Wiu. Although they were masters and servants, their love was unusual. Especially Bailu. Although Mrs. Wang pampered Wiu, she was also worried that her temperament would suffer in the future, so she let the prudent Bai Lu accompany Gu Wiu, and she usually took care of her a lot. Bai Lu first boasted, it's good for you to do this today. The old lady is your grandmother. You should respect her more. As for the big room, even if you don't like it anymore, you don't have to confront her anymore. But the most important thing is the lord of the country. He is your father and has loved you since childhood. But the love between father and daughter, although they are connected by blood, is not really continuous. You used to go home once a year, and it would be fine to make a fuss once a year. But now you stay here every day. It's still the same as before. I'm afraid no matter how good the relationship is, it will be difficult. Bai Lu pursed her lips, seeming to hesitate whether to speak so absolutely, but in the end she gritted her teeth and said softly, maintain. When she said these words, she was still carefully observing Gu Wiu's emotions, and she was relieved to see that she had been quiet and not angry or unhappy. Gu Wiu was still thinking about Li Qingyuan. Hearing these words, she listened carefully. Knowing that Bai Lu was doing this for her own good, she replied, I know. After she paused, then said softly, I'll be nice to him. It's not for those so-called interests, nor is it because she wants to be nice to those who are worried about her unhappy stay in the government office and seek asylum. She wants to be nice to him, just because, she thinks. She didn't want to watch that man die depressed in this life. She hopes that he will be healthy and live a long life. Thinking of that man, Gu Wiu returned to his senses. He didn't take back his thoughts until Hong Shuang drew the curtain to come in, and asked, how? When she spoke, she sat up, her eyebrows were also anxious. I'm so thirsty. Hong Shuang's face was red and it was frozen out. She took the water that Gu Wiu handed over, took a big sip, waited until her throat was moist, looked at her, frowned, and asked strangely, Miss, why on earth are you asking about that dude thing? Seeing Gu Wiu's dumbfounded look, and knowing that she could not get a result, she said everything she inquired about. I thought it would take some effort to play, but I didn't expect to find someone to ask, and I knew what kind of person he was. Hong Shuang said with a bulging face, and said with a sullen expression, that Li Qilang is a famous dude in Beijing. He doesn't have the demeanor of a family child. He knows how to fight cockfighting lackeys all day long. He also likes to fight. He went to school in looming study, where the third young master had been, but his learning was really bad. I heard that he is the last class every year. If he hadn't had such a family background, he would have been dismissed a long time ago. Hong Shuang really doesn't understand why the young lady cares about him so much. She felt like a small paw was scratching her heart, but knowing that the lady would not confuse her, she had to stand aside with a puffed face. Gu Weihua didn't know what the two maids were thinking. She was really stunned. Cockfighting minions, fighting dudes, fights, last grades, etc. Is this really her general? How can it be? Her general is obviously such a majestic person. Even if he is not too old now, he should be a gentleman and gentleman from the family. It is the one that is highly praised by the elders. What? How could such a person be? Since waking up, Gu Weihua has been sober and sensible. For the first time, he felt that the world was a little magical. She blinked and sat on the chaise couch blankly, without speaking for a while. Seeing her like this, Hong Shuang was a little worried. Just when she wanted to talk, there was a voice from outside, "Miss, Lord Guo, please come over for dinner." Great room. A table of meals has long been set up in the house warm as spring, including 6 meatballs, sweet and sour pork loin, zhiuqia fish and sanzan chicken soup, as well as all kinds of fresh seasonal vegetables. It is a whole table. Fully stocked. Dingguo Guoji is in his early 40s this year. He is wearing a long gown and looks very elegant. Even though the traces of time have been added to his face now, the handsomeness of his youth can be seen from his eyebrows. He is a confidant of the emperor and an important minister in the court. He usually looks like he is embraced everywhere, but now he is walking anxiously in the house with his hands behind his back. Chansui Chongshan grew up with him since he was a child, and he is considered to be Guoji's nanny brother. This meeting with Guoji didn't seem to be at ease on weekdays. It was funny and helpless and said, "Master Guo, you have been gone for almost a quarter of an hour, aren't you tired?" Guoji shook his head, as if thinking of something, suddenly turned his head and asked, "How long have you been there?" Chongshan replied, "It's almost 2/4 of an hour." "You said it was pretty brutal, did you refuse to come again?" When the man in his early 40s said this, his tone was careful and his expression was low. After he said it, he glanced at the table of dishes behind him again, all Gu Weihua favorite things. He sighed softly, was silent for a moment, and then said, "If she refuses to come, let someone deliver the food." The room was brightly lit, and several standing palace lanterns shone on Guoji's handsome and elegant face, and he could see his long eyelashes hanging down on his face, forming a sparse and dense projection, where no one spoke. There was a bit of loneliness in the room. Seeing him like this, Chongshan just wanted to lenient a few words. There was a general announcement from outside, "Master Guo, Miss Fifth is here." The voice just fell. The silent man raised his head abruptly, with his head still lowered. His face was full of joy and brows. He even strode out before Chongshan left. When he saw the girl who was being supported by Bai Lu, just stand still. Under the night, Gu Weihua wore a gorgeous vermilion cloak, embroidered with clusters of peony flowers. Inside was a moon-white makeup jacket with sleeves, and underneath was a delicate green woven gold dress. It was vaguely visible that he was wearing a pair of currants on his feet. Lanja's most popular tipped embroidered shoes are decorated with a small pearl on the top. She actually looked nothing like her birth mother, Wang Chunde. Wang Chunde's appearance is just like her name, distant mountains are like dye, near water contains smoke. She is the daughter of Wang's boudoir. She has learned poems and etiquette since childhood. Forget. Can you worry about it? Her appearance is very delicate and bright. If Wang Chunde is a splashing painting of Jiangnan landscape, then Gu Weihua is the strongest stroke in the painter's pen. Even if she is among thousands of people, she is still the most eye-catching one. But every time Guoji saw his prostitute, Wang Chunde's figure always appeared in his mind. He always remembered that when he saw Wang Chunde for the first time, it seemed to be the same weather. The girl was wearing a cloak with a lamp in her hand, walking towards him across the corridor with her footsteps. When she saw him, it seemed that still stunned for a while, but instead showed a faint smile, and then lowered his head again. Gu Wuji didn't like to read when he was young, but when he saw Wang Chunde that day, he had a lot of words in his head that praised beautiful women before. There is a sentence that says something like this: when she lowered her head, the water lotus under the moon was blowing with the wind, with endless tenderness. It was the first time in his life that Gu Wuji had a heart-stirring feeling. During the days when he lived in the Wang family, he was like a stupid second stupid. He tried his best to meet her by chance. He liked to watch her smile. She laughed. When you don't know it, your eyes will bend into a crescent shape. And the day when she smiled most happily was when he secretly took her out of the house, took her to ride a horse, and picked wild flowers all over the mountains for her. She stood on the green hill, the mountain wind was blowing her long hair, and the lilac dress on her body was brought up by the wind, and she looked up at him, bent her eyes, and said softly, "Brother Gu, this is how I grew up." Big, happiest day. Master of the country. Bai Lu's greeting made Gu Wuji withdraw his mind from his old thoughts. He nodded, but his eyes always fell on Gu Wu's body. The girl lowered her head, her red lips were gently pressed, her toes touched the ground, her head up. The pearls shine more brilliantly in the light. It seems to be hesitating how to speak. Gu Wuji's handsome and sparse eyebrows burst into a smile. He actually wanted to reach out and touch her head, but he just thought about it. He coughed slightly, and he spoke to Gu with a particularly cautious tone. Worry-free said, "It's pretty brutal, let's go in for dinner." Gu Wu nodded and agreed. Gu Wuji wanted to be alone with his daughter, so naturally he didn't ask extra people to serve him, only Chongshan and Bailu were left. He sat opposite Gu Wu, took the initiative to pick up food for others, and said while picking up, "It's the same cook before, do you taste the same as before?" Finished. She watched Gu Wu eagerly eating, and when she took a bite of sweet and sour pork ribs, she asked in a low voice, "How's it going?" After Gu Wu married Li Qingyuan later, he didn't like to eat sweets anymore. The taste in this memory was actually almost forgotten, but the man on the other side kept looking at her expectantly. She really didn't want to brush his mind. He nodded, "It's delicious." Although he still cherished the words as gold and only said 2 words, but Gu Wuji was so happy. This was the first time that Manman had fallen on his face. He was so happy. The chopsticks in his hand seemed to be unable to stop, and every dish was piled on the people's plate, and it was almost piled up into a hill. Seeing him like this, Gu Wu felt a little uncomfortable. She actually wants to talk to him well, want to say "I miss you so much" and tell him not to be so cautious, but she hasn't gotten along well with her father since she was a child, and she doesn't know the relationship between father and daughter. What's it like to get along normally? If it is a general, Gu Wu couldn't help but remember what Li Qingyuan had said to her before. It's quite man, the friendship between family members is the strongest, but you must also learn to express. Don't always let people guess what you are thinking. Just say what you want to do. Don't think one day. When I said that, the other party was no longer there. Emil with the hand holding the chopsticks. Gu Wu looked at the man opposite, and remembered how he was lying on the bed in his previous life, depressed. Even if she learned to let go in her previous life, it would be too late to get along with him. And in this life she seemed to hesitate for a long time in her heart, but in the end she pressed her lips, and put a chopstick on Gu Wuji. Under his dull eyes, she said softly, "I don't know what you like to eat, this dish is not bad." She lowered her head and moved the dishes on the plate with chopsticks. Perhaps it was because she was a little at a loss when she did something like this for the first time, but she still tried her best to finish her words, "Don't always pick me up dishes. You can eat it yourself." This is the end. Not only Gu Wuji, but even Chongshan and Bai Lu were a little surprised. But after the astonishment, he was happy, especially Gu Wuji. The eye sockets were a little red, and his voice became a little choked. Okay, okay, I will eat too, I will eat now. He said. Put the food that Gu Wuji gave him into his mouth. Gu Wuji couldn't help coughing, not knowing whether it was because he ate too fast or was too agitated. He put his hands on the edge of the table, bent over, and blushed from coughing. Chongshan hurriedly poured him a cup of tea. Gu Wuji also put down his chopsticks anxiously, frowned, looked at him all the time, waited for someone to cough up, and asked, "Are you okay?" Gu Wuji waved his hand and said with a smile, "It's okay, I'm just so happy." After finishing speaking, he put a chopstick in another person and said, "Hurry up." He turned his head and ordered with Chongshan, "Go and get my wine." He was happy today and wanted to drink more. Chongshan just wanted to persuade. Gu Wuji frowned and said, "Drinking hurts your body, don't always drink." His previous life father caused a migraine because of drinking all the time, but he couldn't be cured afterwards. Gu Wuji was startled, but he laughed again for a while. He turned his head to look at Gu Wuji, watching her delicate face under the lights, and even his voice became much more gentle. "Okay, listen to you. Don't drink." When Gu Wuji saw this, he lowered his head to eat again, but wondered how to speak, and asked her father to agree to her to go to school and looming study. In this room, the father and daughter ate dinner in a harmonious atmosphere. On the other side, Wei Qiaogong's mansion seemed very deserted. The second and third rooms of Li's family went out of town, leaving only the Dafang line in the capital. They usually ate together on weekdays, but even so, it was only Li. The old lady, Wei Qiaogong Li Senshan, and Li Senshan's successor Yinwan and her son Dong'er were all four of them. Mrs. Li is 55 this year. She is dressed plainly and wears a string of Buddhist beads on her wrist all the time. She just curled her eyebrows while watching a table of dishes and sighed, "I don't know what happened to Xiao Qi." Hearing this, Li Senshen beside her acted for a while, and then said in a deep voice, "If he has a bad time, he will naturally come back." Mrs. Li frowned when she heard this. She is usually a gentle temper, but every time she encounters Li Kainyuan, she can't help but quarrel with her own only son. She is still worried that the two of them will be again. The argument arose, put down his chopsticks, and said gently, "Don't worry, mother, I have sent someone to deliver the letter to Hintai Temple before. Your birthday is coming soon, and Kilang will definitely be back." Heard this. The dissatisfaction on Mrs. Li's face was a little faint. She dialed the Buddhist beads and said, "Qi Lang is coming back this time, you should pay attention to it. Don't always say those unpleasant things, and let the popularity go away." Li Senshen frowned, and Yinwan pulled his sleeves just as he tried to refute. He was silent for a while, but after all, he didn't speak. Several people in the house were eating lukewarmly. At the end of the concierge, there was a white figure turning over and dismounting. It was Li Kainyuan, who hadn't returned home for a long time. He was still dressed in the usual clothes, wearing a shirt with sleeves, as if he was born not afraid of cold. The red lantern was swayed by the wind. The young man couldn't see clearly, and when someone approached, he said unequivocally, "Seventh Master." Li Kainyuan gave a faint he threw the horsewhip in his hand to the young man, and when he was about to enter, he glanced at the door plaque bestowed by Emperor Xian, with a mocking smile on his face. Seeing the whip that fell from the sky, the little servant hurriedly reached out to catch it. Standing behind Li Kainyuan, he didn't notice the mocking smile on his face. He just said with a respectful voice, "It's dark, the little one will get you a lantern." "Right. No need to," Li Kainyuan said in a faint voice. Before the young man could say anything, he raised his leg and entered the house. There were not many people in the huge Wei Qiaogong mansion, and only a few servants were seen along the way. For Li Kainyuan who suddenly appeared, their faces showed surprises. They didn't seem to expect that the seventh young master, who had not returned home for a long time, would be in this way. Appeared one night. When you want to please someone, they are already far away. Li Kainyuan walked through this mansion where he lived since he was a child. The expression on his face was always faint. Occasionally, when someone greeted him, he just nodded indifferently until he walked to the main hall where Mrs. Li lived. The expression only eased. Standing down the corridor was a maid dressed in a green jersey named Chanyi, who was Mrs. Li's grand maid. She originally came out to order people to prepare Chu Li Gang for Mrs. Li to moisturize her throat, but she did not expect to see Li Kainyuan when she raised her head. It took a while before she greeted him happily. The shouting person, seventh master, you are back. The old lady also talked about you just now. If she knows that you are back, she must be happy. A smile appeared on Li Kainyuan's handsome face. He glanced at the candlelit room behind him, and his tone was milder. Have grandma eat dinner. I just used it, the food is still hot. Chanyi said with a smile, it's cold outside. Go in, I'll let someone add another pair of chopsticks. The smile on Li Kainyuan's face faded as soon as he heard only used, and he didn't really want to go in. How could Chanyi not know his temperament? Seeing him like this, she whispered, for a while, the old lady has been thinking of you, did not sleep well at night, and coughed a few times in the morning. She has always been a stubborn temper. It is useless to say anything. Listen to you say a few words. Now that you are back, you persuaded the old lady to take a medicine. Things that can be healed by taking a few medicines will be prolonged again. When she spoke, she kept looking at his expression carefully, and when she saw his face struggling and nodded, she breathed a sigh of relief and smiled, you go in. She said as she led people in, for fear of him when I came to the door, I had to regret it again, and even made a special voice, and said inside, the seventh master is back. Li Kainyuan never thought of going back. Although he was not happy to disagree with those people, he didn't want to see his grandmother sad. He lifted the curtain with his long hand and bent over and went in. He had been in the freezing weather for a long time and was suddenly greeted by the oncoming heater. Some people who didn't get used to it paused. When I was about to go in again, I heard a string of footsteps. At the forefront was Mrs. Li, who was supported by a maid. Her calm face was full of excitement at this time, and her eyes were still red. Seeing Li Kainyuan standing at the door, tears rolled down. Pushing away the help of the maid, walked over, held Li Kainyuan's hand, and took a closer look. Seeing him well, he slapped his arm severely and cried and said, you little debt collector, why don't you want to go home for so long? Li Kainyuan saw that his grandmother, who loved him since he was a child, was crying with red eyes, and felt a little uncomfortable. He just wanted to say a few words of relief when he heard a stern male voice coming in, you still know how to come back. Hearing this voice, Li Kainyuan's face sank suddenly. He pursed his lips and stood there without making a sound. The hand that he had raised to comfort his grandmother was held behind him and gently squeezed, but his faint gaze swept toward the source of the sound. His eyelids are thin, and the tails of his eyes are a bit narrow and long. He usually looks at people with a smile, and looks lazy and inattentive, but this is mixed with some coldness, as if the frost outside is trapped in it, making people laugh. Some are afraid to approach. The youth has a handsome face, especially under the warm lights, like a good piece of jade. If he smiles, I'm afraid the spring sunshine can't compare to him, but he will press his lips, his face will be cold, and the sharp edges and corners will be like a sharp knife. Boss. Mrs. Li didn't expect that Li Senkan, who had just promised her, just saw her face to face with her precious grandson again. She was angry and anxious, and her voice became more serious. How did you agree just now? Mine. Although Yanwan didn't speak, she gently pulled Li Senshan's sleeve, and signaled him not to say anything that was unacceptable at this juncture. Li Senshen pursed his lips, his eyes fell on Li Kainyuan for a long time, but finally he turned his sleeves and went in first. Yin Wan led Dong standing on the spot, smiling to greet Li Kainyuan, killing, go in for dinner, there are several dishes you like today, and your grandmother is looking forward to your return all day long, even Dong miss you too. After she said this, she put her hand on the shoulder of the 3-year-old boy and gave a light push. Although Dong is young, he also knows how to watch his words and looks. He pursed his lips and took a peek at Li Kainyuan. He was afraid of his brother when he was a child. He always felt that he was more terrible than his father. This meeting saw him with a cold face. He was also a little bit stunned, grabbed his fingers, and shouted dryly, "Brother!" He quickly hid behind Yin Wan, but still couldn't help but sneak out to see Li Kainyuan's reaction. Li Kainyuan's hostility towards Yin Wan's mother and son was far less profound than that of Li Senshen. This meeting was just a faint and turned to Mrs. Li, and said warmly, "Grandma, let's go in." Mrs. Li held Li Kainyuan's hand and nodded, "Okay." During the dinner, I don't know if it was because of Mrs. Li's previous anger, Li Senshen didn't speak anymore, but he kept looking towards his eldest son with a complicated expression. He listened to Mrs. Li's muttering, "Why are you so thin, Many?" He also took a look specifically. "It is indeed thinner than when I saw it before. And also much higher. The figure of a young man is just like a spring bamboo shoot. It can be a little bit taller in a spring rain." The young man who used to be shorter than him, in a blink of an eye, is actually taller than him. Li Senkan can't tell what kind of feeling he feels in his heart. A little happy, and a little helpless. He didn't know why his eldest son became what he is now. Obviously he was so good in the past, he could write poetry at the age of 7, write articles at the age of 10, and even his riding and shooting made him admired by all his subordinates, but now he has become such an unruly appearance. And what made him most helpless was their father-son relationship. Li Senkan always remembered that every time he came back from a war in the past, his young eldest son would squat in front of the door with his hands on his cheeks. It seemed that the carriage and horses going forward would jump up with a smile whenever he saw his figure, his eyes sparkling. Called him, "Father." He has never forgotten these memories. But the reality is that their father and son are going farther and farther away, even if he sits beside him, there seems to be a galaxy across it. When Li Senshen saw Li Kainyuan talking to Mrs. Li, his eyebrows did not condense. He was moved by his heart when he wanted to order some food, when he heard Li Kainyuan smile and say to Mrs. Li, "If grandma's words are for master, I'm afraid I should be upset when I hear it. He always felt that during the time I stayed at Hintai Temple, I almost ate the temple." Hearing these words in his gentle voice, Li Senshen felt like an unknown fire was rising in his heart. He suddenly put down his chopsticks again, and said coldly, "You really want to be a monk in Hintai Temple?" Finished. Seeing that the smile on Li Kainyuan's face faded, he was afraid that the chat would break up like before, so he calmed down and said with others, "If you really don't want to go to the study, you will go to the barracks with me tomorrow." Mrs. Li frowned, Boss Li Senkan did not back down this time, and said bluntly, "Mother, he is 16 this year, and I have made meritorious deeds at his age. Even if you want to protect him, the way forward is his own, we people. He's getting old, how long can you and I protect him?" Heard this, Mrs. Li couldn't speak for a while. Yin Wan's mother and son would not even speak at this time. She lowered her head, holding the veil and wiping Donger's hands irrelevantly. The room was so quiet. Li Kainyuan lowered his head and held chopsticks with his slender fingers. He didn't seem to hear Li Senshen's words. He was still eating food by himself, but he couldn't hold back his temper and was ready to speak again. When he suddenly put down his chopsticks, he smiled. The handsome face of the teenager was dazzling under the lights, but the corners of his slightly raised mouth were sneered without hiding. "Okay, I will go to school tomorrow." At this time, Dingguo Gongfu, Guwuji stared at his baby girl blankly, and said, "What, are you going to school?" Guwuji was really stunned. Even Chongshan and Bai Lu stayed for a while, then looked at Guwu in disbelief. Everyone in the mansion doesn't know that Guwu doesn't like to study when she was a child. She has been spoiled since she was a child. Everyone is used to her, especially the old lady of the Wang family. Guwu always does what she wants. Yes, after so many years, Guwu probably hasn't read the book well except for those scripts, let alone those female celebrities. Guwuji was afraid that Guwu didn't know the rules of Looming Academy, so he said to his precious daughter in a good voice, "It's pretty barbaric. You have to learn how to shoot. Every year." He said this sentence particularly lightly, it has to be rated. He doesn't care how his daughter's grades are. He protects his daughter, and no one can take her. But the problem is Guwu was proud when she was a child, and she paid special attention to her face. She was not allowed to be looked down upon by others. If she got the last grade, she would be unhappy. He thought and thought, carefully discussing with others, "It's pretty brutal, why don't I invite you as Ixi, let him teach you at home." When speaking, he kept observing Guwu's face, for fear of her. Be unhappy again. If this is placed before Guwu should indeed be upset, but now she has more experience for a lifetime, how could she still be like before, crying if she doesn't get results? She just pressed her lips, her delicate little face showed a firm expression, and her tone was very decisive, "No, I'm going to study." Second elder sister teaches there, seventh younger sister also goes to school there, and even the ninth younger brother is also studying in Yufu. I don't want to stay in the mansion alone. This sentence pierced Guwuji's heart like a needle, making him suddenly sore. Because of her temperament, she has had no friends since she was a child. As long as he thought of her pitiful staying in the house when she was a child, his eyes couldn't help but feel sour. Guwuji has always been upholding the principle of the world is big, the happiness of the daughter is the most important. He coaxed people, "Okay, if you want to go, we will go." After speaking, Guwuji smiled again, "When the spring begins, I will help you talk to Mr. Su from Looming College." I didn't think Guwu shook his head, looked at his eyes and said softly, "I want to go tomorrow." Guwuji stunned and said, "But in 1 month, it's time for the Chinese New Year." Especially in the freezing weather, he didn't want his daughter to suffer, but when he saw Guwu's depressed expression, he couldn't help but be defeated. Repeatedly coaxed, "If you want to go, go, I will take a break tomorrow, and accompany you." He thought in his heart that this estimation was quite a whim. It is estimated that in a few days, she should think that school is too early and the school food is not delicious. Since this is the case, why should he upset her at this time? Guwu was relieved when he saw that he had agreed. It was late at night, and she should also leave. Although Guwuji was reluctant to bear it, but still worried that she had just returned. She was exhausted and had to rest well. He sent her out the door. When he walked to the door, Guwu noticed the gaze behind him. The phrase "father" in his mouth has been voicing more than 10 times, and I still can't say it. I can only turn my head to look at the person, pursing his lips, and whispered, "You go in the house." "Good." Guwuji smiled and nodded, but still looked at her and refused to go in. Guwu had no choice, and didn't know what to say, so she could only drag Bailu away, and when she walked away, she could still notice the gentle and long gaze behind her. She sighed in her heart and felt that she was really useless. Up. After thinking about it, I couldn't help but think of Li Kainyuan. If the general was here, he would definitely know how to tell her. Seeing her hanging her head beside Bailu, she smiled and encouraged, "Miss, it's good to be like this today." Guwu pursed his lips, glanced behind him, and sighed, "Let's go." "Yes." Bailu held the lamp in her palm and guarded Guwu and walked carefully towards the star-picking tower. On the way, she still wanted to ask. Others didn't know why the lady wanted to go to the study, but she could guess some of them, but she had never met. Where on earth's Li Qigongzi attracted the young lady? I know what you are thinking. Gu Weil looked at the road in front of her without squinting her eyes. She pursed her lips and said in a low voice, Bailu, I know that you and Hongshuang treat me sincerely, and I know that you are worried, but, something, I can't explain to you now. After she finished speaking, she turned her head and glanced at Bailu, and Mayali's clear eyes were shining under the light. As long as you know, I won't do anything to hurt yourself, and I'm still me. These words. It's actually a bit strange. But Bai Lu looked at these familiar eyes, hesitated, and nodded without asking any more. The two continued to walk forward, and when they hurried out of the yard, they saw a figure standing on the path not far away. The man stood in the shadows and did not carry any lanterns in his hands, but the Dingguo Palace has always been indispensable. Silver coins, the servants underneath are worried that the masters will be difficult at night, even these trails are hung with lanterns. And so, Gu Weyu still saw that person. The man was only 10 years old, wearing a blue shirt, wrapped in a big cloak. His face was somewhat similar to her father, but the eyebrows were a bit less refined and more delicate, but because of the fact that he kept pursing his lips. The boy didn't seem to be as agile at this age, but with some stubborn arrogance. He was standing there, looking directly at the yard, not knowing what he was thinking. His eyes were a little lost. It wasn't until he saw Gu Weiyu's gaze that he suddenly woke up. His gaze was complicated and with some resentment. He turned and ran without saying anything. Yes. Bai Lu took a picture with the lantern, only to see the figure of the teenager running away. Master 9. Gu Weiyu nodded, but still looked at the direction Gu Zhifei had left. He was no longer there. It was dark, only sparse shadows horizontally. She clearly saw Gu Zhu with resentful eyes. No, I can't help but think of the boy who followed his father to pick her up in Lanja. He was also wearing such a blue shirt that day, but he had passed his father a long time ago. When I saw her, the first sentence was, how dare he treat you like this? Then, under her dazed gaze, she took up her fist and slammed it at Zhao Qinzhu, who had just entered the door. She and her younger brother have never dealt with it since they were young. She hates Fu Zhang for taking her mother's place. Naturally, she blames Gu Zhifei for being born, and what about Gu Zhifei? He also resented her. He was obviously a son of the Quagong mansion, but because of her, he had never liked her since he was a child. It doesn't matter if she bullied him again and again when she was a child. She thought she was frustrated. Gu Zhifei should be the happiest. He was crushed by her for so many years, and he could finally exhale, but never expected that he would stand by her side and her all the way back to Beijing, even later. In the capital, she was ridiculed and ridiculed by others, and he repeatedly defended her in front of everyone. Miss. Seeing that she was still there, Bai Lu couldn't help calling her, what's the matter? Gu Weiyu recovered, she retracted her gaze, shook her head, and said, let's go. When she returned to the star-catching building, she had all the people back down after washing up. Although she was arrogant, she was still thinking about winter and night. Never let the maids watch the night. But there are so many things today, and her mind is a little confused, and she can't sleep a little. Before, Li Qingyuan would hold her to read to her when he could not sleep. Now he is not around and she has no books to read, so she simply picked up a blank booklet that she had made in the carriage and sat down. Wrote on the chair, I have finally returned to the capital. I am so happy to see them again and miss the general. Although they said that the general is completely different from the one I know, I still miss him so much. Fortunately, I can go to the school tomorrow. I hope I can see the general. After writing, Gu Weiyu held his chin and waited for the ink to dry. Her handwriting was taught to her by Li Qingyuan. When she looked at these words, she could recall the way Li Qingyuan held her hand and a pen to teach her before, and said it's strange to come. After writing these words, Her previously agitated heart calmed down a lot, and she read the words on the notebook again, and then she cocked her lips and put the notebook in the box and took it again. The small lock is locked. The next day. Main hall. The people in Dingguo Gongfu knew about Gu Weiyu's going to school early this morning. Everyone was shocked, but most of them were like Gu Wuji, thinking that she was on a whim, so no one said anything. Gu Wuji wanted to make her happy. After Gu Weiyu saluted Mrs. Gu, he was so happy that he said to her, "Many, go, Daddy will send you to the school." When Wang Chunde was just pregnant, Gu Wuji likes to hold her hand and say to her bulging abdomen, "After you are born, Dad will take you to martial arts school. It doesn't matter whether it is a girl or a boy." Unexpectedly, one day, he would really let him experience the joy of sending his daughter to school. Gu Wuji stood aside, looking at Gu Weiyu. His face was full of unbearable joy, but Gu Jufi, who was sitting aside, suddenly lowered his eyes, his lips pressed, his little hand on his knee couldn't help it. Clenched into a small fist. Father never gave him. He even felt that his father had no idea where he went to school. The fathers of other families hope that his son can become a talent and can carry forward the family lintel, but his father never pays attention to him, whether he is good or bad, he doesn't care. Oh no! He also cared sometimes. Gu Jufi twitched at the corner of his mouth, revealing a sneer. As long as Gu Weiyu is involved, his father will be like a different person. He still remembers one time when Gu Weiyu wronged him and broke her favorite vase. His father asked him and Gu Weiyu to apologize with a cold face. The hand was suddenly held by someone. Gu Jiafei knew that it was his mother. He didn't want her to worry. He took a deep breath and planned to go to Yu's house first. It was still early, but he really didn't want to see this situation again. Unexpectedly, he just took a deep breath. "Get up, haven't spoken yet." Gu Weiyu over there said, "Brother 9, you can go out with us."